Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very glad to be here. As he said, I think this is my fourth time to attend this conference. I'm feeling myself. I'm feeling like a regular member of KSPS, already. I'm glad to be able to come back here. Today my topic is reproducibility crisis, and I'd like to connect this to my own study about the demarcation problem. And I noticed that some of the slides, in the previous presenter was also about this crisis in clinical research. I'm really sorry that I couldn't understand the Korean part of the discussion. Anyway, let me first talk a little bit on this demarcation problem itself. As the philosophers of science all know that the distinction between science and something else is a kind of very long-term interest of philosophers of science. And so we have philosophers of science and natural philosophers have been talking about this for a long time. And for example, Kant, maybe you may be surprised that Kant has talks something about this demarcation problem, but actually he had a very interesting comment on the chemistry in his foundation of natural philosophy. And according to him, the chemistry is not a science, not a Wissenschaft, because it is not based on mathematical laws, at his time. So it was very interesting that in the very beginning of this concern, we already had a concern about the mathematical law. And William Whewell, who is kind of the original person who began philosophy of science in England, Whewell was a central figure in the establishment of British Association for the Advancement of Science. He was one of the secretaries in early days, and he also became a president of this association. And according to some historical research of this association, his view was kind of a part of the official ideology of that association. So, and some fields were not admitted into this association because they don't really follow the Whewellian philosophy of science. And of course, we know that the Vienna Circle was well known for its demarcation between science and metaphysics. And Popper's the original book was also about demarcation between science and metaphysics, not pseudoscience. And the demarcation problem, as we know now, namely that the line between science and pseudoscience, is probably proposed by Popper during 1950s in one of his public lectures. And there he, of course, very well is very well known among philosophers. He criticized Marxism and psychoanalysis as a kind of pseudoscience. And also, actually, another field he regarded as non-science was evolutionary theory. That was very interesting. So the demarcation problem, as we know, began in 1950s, and many demarcation criteria were proposed during 1960s and 70s, like the falsifiability criteria. Criterion, as we know, that is kind of standard in this field. A claim is not scientific if it's not falsifiable. That's very famous. And actually, Kuhn had a paper on this issue, and interestingly, his view of this, his view is the so-called normal science is very important for science. Not the revolution part, but the normal science part is very important for the decision whether a field is scientific or not. So the basically what he claims is a puzzle solving and the paradigm is definitive characteristics of science. And for example, the astrology is not scientific according to Kuhn because it doesn't solve any puzzle. And of course, we know that Lakatos have a distinction between progressive and degenerative research programs. And if some researchers stick to a degenerative research program, namely it doesn't lead to any successful prediction, well, then the field is not really scientific. And Paul Thagard, in a paper in 1970s, claimed that making progress is an important part of scientificity. And Michael Ruth had, this is a very interesting episode, that he had to testify in a courtroom about the so-called creation science trial. And maybe he is one of very rare philosophers, who had to testify about philosophy of science in a courtroom. And he testified that science have several characteristics like falsifiability, testability, tentativeness, and seeking for natural laws, explaining using natural laws. And the so-called creation science does not have any of these characteristics, so it's not a science. That was his testimony, and this testimony was used by the judge to rule that the Arkansas law about the equal treatment of science, creation science, and the evolution science is not really scientific, but it's a kind of religious education. So this is a kind of very interesting episode in the history of demarcation program. But nowadays, philosophers of science do not talk much about demarcation. And one important paper responsible for that is Larry Loudon's Demise of the Demarcation Program. And he showed that none of those proposed demarcation criteria maybe I'm wrong. None of those criteria are sufficient and necessary and sufficient condition, and actually they cannot be regarded as a necessary condition because there are many exceptions. And so he could cite many historical episodes like from Copernicus, Newton, Galileo, Kepler. You can any of those founding fathers of science, modern science, did the science properly. If any of these demarcation criteria are accepted. And Loudon also claimed that there is no essential property of science, so the problem itself is a kind of pseudo problem. And there are good and bad science claims, good science and bad science, but no pseudoscience. So that the idea of demarcating science and pseudoscience is false claim or misdirected enterprise. And many philosophers of science agree with him. And for example, in United States, the intelligent design theory, the life and the intelligence are created by some intelligent designer. If we say God, that's religion, so they don't use the word God, but the intelligent designer, that's the preferred word nowadays. And some people try to teach this intelligence design theory in public schools, and some other people want that those things should be excluded from public school because this is a kind of religious education. Well, and many philosophers of science are again, asked to comment on this, and they prefer to say, this is a bad science, dead science, or so on and so forth. But they generally they avoid calling intelligent design theory pseudoscience. And Samuel Kasha's book I think this is a very influential introductory textbook for the general people about philosophy of science. And this one also avoids the demarcation. And he seems to claim that it's just science has just a familiar resemblance, so there is no defining property for science. But I don't think this is the end of the story because there are many practical issues that call for the science, non-science. Maybe pseudoscience is not an appropriate word for in some of the cases, but still there are many issues in which we need some demarcation. And I list some of them here. Parapsychology, and I have some another slide about this. Creationism and intelligence theory, I explained that. And alternative medicine, there are some people who refuse standard medicine, preferring alternative medicine. And for example, that Steve Jobs died by cancer, and he preferred some alternative medicine. So, if he received some standard medicine, he could survive. But he didn't want that. And health cosmetic products. Well, I have another separate slide for this. Attack on climate science. Well, so-called climate gate. Some people claim that climate science is kind of conspiracy, and some people claim that there's nothing like climate change, and it became a kind of social problem when some people revealed some emails by climate scientists seeming to say that they are falsifying data or something like that. And that accusation had no ground, but it became a kind of public problem. And the scientificity of climate science, or the scientificity of the claim against climate science, were the issue. And here we now have a problem with fake news on SNS. There are sometimes, very important people like President of the United States, issue some fake news. And what should we do about that? Okay, and the parapsychology. Well, this is related to what I will talk in the latter half. So I give some introduction about this. Well, study of psi phenomena like extrasensory perception or telekinesis. By the way, this is not included in the in the booklet. I'm sorry, I added this later. And this field, well, it existed for a while, like from early 20th century, but it became to attract public interest in 1970s, like people like Uri Geller, and some scientists tested Uri Geller's power, and they confirmed that this guy is psychic. And the magician, James Randi, revealed that this could be a magic, or maybe well, what he showed is he can exactly reproduce what Uri Geller did using magic. Of course, this is not a proof that Uri Geller did magic, but that's a plausible story. And well, but anyway, then after that, parapsychology received more and more attentions, and it has its own international society, academic journal, and so forth. So, as a matter of institution, parapsychology is looks like a fair field of science. And also, it published many seemingly perfectly good scientific papers that claim that psi exists. However, the problem is the replication by outsiders generally fail. Somehow the experiments get positive result when the psi researchers, parapsychologists, does the experiment, but when other people do that, somehow they fail. And actually, parapsychologists have some explanations about this. Because skeptics have, issuing some, the psychic power, to prevent the experiment. So, according to parapsychologists, the failure of the replication itself is a kind of evidence that the psi phenomena exists. But Susan Blackmore, she was once a believer of parapsychology, but later she became, skeptic. She testified that some supposedly best experiments are not conducted in accordance with the published protocol. Even though in the paper they explain, this control was done and such, but the kind of control, promised in the paper are not generally done in the actual experiment. And health and cosmetic products, they this is a kind of very severe problem in terms of the damage to the public. For example, in Japan, we have something like collagen supplements, germanium, bracelets, hydrogen water, and so on and so forth. And those things claim that they are good for health, and they have some seemingly nice scientific explanation. But if you know some science, you can recognize those explanations are totally, wrong or at least misleading. And when they cross some line, then the government issues some warning, but generally they are doing their business really. And so you see something like, in the case of collagen, collagen is a very important part of your skin. Yeah, that's true. And when you age, your skin loses resilience because of the decrease in collagen, and this is also true. Therefore, take collagen by supplements. Well, if you know some biology, orally taken collagen will be digested into ordinary amino acids. So that doesn't make sense to get collagen orally, but if you just be presented by those three lines, then, you may be, convinced that collagen is good for your skin. But so there are those people around, and the claims of such activity force is not enough. Practitioners know that the claim, or at least some parts of them, are false or misleading, and they don't just make mistakes. Their claims resemble to valid scientific claims, and this is not an accident. They are intentionally made to look like science, to express the credibility of science. So those things are happening. Pseudoscience is an expression that can be used to denote this kind of activity and to function as a warning, calling them just bad science like Laudan do not help. And Resnick wrote a paper about this, and he proposed a so-called pragmatic approach. And this approach basically claims that we do not have to have a universal demarcation criterion. Rather, each domain can have a practical demarcation criterion based on its needs. So, and I agree with Resnick that we think practically when we think about the demarcation issue. And however, if criteria are totally domain relative, that will lessen the persuasiveness of the criteria. So I think that we need some general description of what is scientific and what is not scientific. And okay, so yeah, the case I want to look at is a reproducibility crisis, especially in cognitive psychology. proper methodology of science is a very important reason why scientists get interested in the demarcation. The other people are interested in demarcation for many other reasons, but scientists themselves are interested in demarcation because when we don't have clear demarcation between proper methodology and not really proper methodology, the credibility of science itself can be in danger, and the reproducibility crisis is exactly that kind of case. And yeah, you heard about the clinical research, reproducibility crisis in clinical research, and I talk mainly about the psychology part of the story. And in psychology, the beginning of crisis was a paper written by Bem. And Bem is a very well-known cognitive psychologist interested in parapsychology. And so he has been working on this parapsychology for many years, but the impact he had on the psychology itself is a kind of, this new paper written in 2011. And I gave reference for this paper at the end of the slides. So this paper was published on one of the best journals on the field, and so not in parapsychology, but in psychology itself. So that was very important. As I explained, parapsychology has its own journal, but this is not. This paper is on the mainstream psychology journal. And the paper describes 9 experiments, all of which involve influence of future events to present psychological state. So, and this is so-called precognition. It's a kind of psi. And one of the experiments describes a prediction place experiment. Prediction place is so you predict the place of a card. And the interesting finding was that male students predict the place of erotic pictures. The place is randomly determined after the call, and significantly more correctly than by chance. So that was very interesting, and you can give some story about why it works. But that's a nice story. But anyway, that's one example. That one result reported in his paper. And another experiment, ordinary priming experiment, is conducted in a backward manner. So usually, in cognitive psychology, the person gets some priming, some subconscious, the stimulus, and then tested for the effect of priming. But in this paper by them, the priming was given afterward. So the effect was, the tested first, and then the person was given the priming. And them found that the priming was still worked. And the result was significant in 8 of the tests out of 9, and the ordinary significance levels of P is under 0.05. And so that this means, this seems to mean that we have some precognition power, and we are influenced by some of our future experiences. And the trouble was the methodology described in the paper seemed totally in accordance with the ordinary practice by psychology. And the paper was actually accompanied by another paper which analyzes this Bem's claim that they analyzed why such strange results were gained. And one explanation they gave was what Bem did was not a confirmation of hypothesis, but exploration of the hypothesis. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with doing exploratory research, doing some research without having any hypothesis in mind, but then the testing criteria is totally different from the confirmatory research. For example, according to their analysis, there were actually 4 types of cards other than erotic cards. There are the 3 different types of cards, and the participants can be divided in other ways than the male and the female. So actually, they were testing so many different hypotheses at the same time, and the combination of erotic picture and the male students became get some positive results. So the BEM published it. That was the trick. And also, they pointed out the so-called the problem of transpose conditional, and they also conducted a kind of Bayesian reanalysis of the data, and they found that actually the data didn't really support the hypothesis. And this okay.
5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Good. Okay. These problems are usually called by name of P hacking or hacking, and this is the additional slide. Okay, P hacking is a kind of utilization of researcher degree of freedom to obtain less than 0.05 P, like the researcher can decide to stop gathering data when the p-value is good for them, or they can model the data in different ways. Those things are things they can do. So-called hacking is hypothesizing after the results are known, and this is the reason why this is problematic. Is it's like you are testing multiple hypotheses at one point at the same time. And for example, if there are 10 potential hypotheses you can formulate there, and the significance level is 0.05, the chance that you get a positive result for one of those 10 possible hypotheses is like 1/3. So you have a very good chance of getting a positive result, even if there's nothing there. And Faldor effect also influencing negative results are not published, and meta-analysis is biased because of this. And so the problem is, even though BEM did all these things, this was kind of accepted practice in psychology. And so because of this, because of this nature of BEM's paper, the people started worry about other papers, and they started conduct a reproduction of papers published in the seminar journal and some other top journals, and as a result, they get is only 1/3 of the 100 papers produced a significant result in the reproduction study. So 70% was something like 70%. In the case, 70% of the papers published in those journals couldn't get the reproduction. So this is a crisis in psychology, and as you know, as you heard, the similar crisis happening in clinical research also. And as a solution to this problem, various new systems are proposed. So, for example, pre-registration, the experimenter registers details of the research before actually conducting the experiment. And by this, hacking becomes impossible. And open data, if the entire raw data is open, other people can check if the most appropriate analyzing method is used. P-hacking, and easily detect it if you share the data. So those things are recommended now. And still the majority of psychologists are doing their business in a traditional manner. And the question for philosophers like us we can ask a question about scientificity of those research. Is BEM original study scientific, even with each parapsychological result? And is a psychological study that uses the same technique as BEMS, meaning the p-hacking and hacking. Is that kind of study scientific, or is psychology a scientific field if it keeps using the same older methods that are the result like BEMS? This is a kind of question we can ask. And one temptation, and I think Laudan, Okasha, and other philosopher science would give this answer. They may say, yes, to all those questions, and saying that these are still within the boundary of science, and the problem is simply that those studies are bad science. But my opinion is that such an attitude can be systematically exploited by those who have some other intentions than finding truth. What the reproducibility crisis reveals is that there are a number of ways to deceive lay people with seemingly perfect research results. With new cosmetic, new health product, new therapy, new study method, and everything else. I gave some example. And in the case of psychology, the ratio of real result was a third, and with a bad intention, the ratio of real results can be made almost zero. You can exploit all sorts of techniques if you want to, exploit all these techniques. And if we admit psychology as it is as scientific, we may have to call those deceptive people using exactly the same research practice as scientific too. And but I think that the leveling of pseudoscience, is exactly for such activities. So I think this is the time to start to use this level of pseudoscience. And I'm not going to propose a full-fledged demarcation criteria here. Rather, I simply propose to add a practical demarcation criterion given this situation. This is if a field of study keeps using research practice that is known to produce regularly a conclusion that a certain effect exists when it actually does not, then the field is not scientific. This is my addition to whatever else we have as a demarcation criteria. I think this we need to add this. And we need further clarification of details of this proposal, but I think something in this direction is needed. And I just added, I said regularly, and sorry, I have one more slide here. Traditional p-value suggests that 1/20th of error is acceptable, but and I think this is for good reason. And if the rare rate is 1/2, I think we cannot call it unreliable, but this is a line to liberal. So I think that we need to have some line between 1/20th and 1/2. But I think that where it should be determined by looking at various factors. Okay, thank you very much.